The trumpets of war blared through the streets as flames devoured everything in their path. Millions wept as Roman soldiers cut down civilians and enemy soldiers alike in the hundreds of thousands. Even the Jewish temple was wiped from the face of the earth. Having witnessed all this war and chaos, Josephus could only conclude with one thing: nothing was able to save Jerusalem from being destroyed. But how did we get here? How could Rome destroy centuries of Jewish culture, and who was in the right? In today's video, we uncover the truth of the Jewish-Roman War and discover what was really behind it. Rome and the Jews were profoundly different cultures, and it's easy to see why. On one hand, we have the Jews, a nation who believed in an all-powerful, abstract God, whereas the pagan world that surrounded them worshipped many flawed and human-like deities. Jew society also placed deep emphasis on ritual purity, such as the avoidance of abortion and deep religious control on Jewish life. So when they encountered Roman customs like violent arena sports or idol worship, they saw Roman culture as fundamentally, quote, unacceptable. But despite the stark difference, Roman Judea shared two key traits: strong national identity and histories forged through hardship. On one hand, we have Rome. Rome had nearly been destroyed by Carthage. Hundreds of thousands had died in the Punic Wars, but Rome still emerged with a single lesson: survival came through absolute military power. That mindset echoed in the Gallic Wars, when Julius Caesar's legions killed or enslaved millions. To the Romans, war wasn't just defense, it was destiny. For the Jews, war was a test of faith. By 66 AD, they'd already endured centuries of exile and conquest. But the Jews responded very differently, not with empire, but with resilience. A pivotal moment of this was the Babylonian exile. Though uprooted, the Jews preserved their identity and were later restored to Judea by Cyrus the Great. Then, in the 160s BC, the Maccabees proved that faith and resistance against oppression could bring political freedom. Judaism and national identity had become fundamentally inseparable. If Jewish religion was threatened, so was Jewish existence. Keep this in mind throughout the video. Now, Rome sought control through dominance. The Jews sought freedom through faith. Two powers shaped by trauma, destined to collide. And this difference in culture was revealed through Rome's handling of Judea, as Roman influence would really begin to take hold under the reign of Herod the Great in 37 BC. Wait a minute, wasn't Herod a Jewish king? Why Herod? Well, up until his appointment, Roman influence on Judea was relatively minimal, with the Hasmonean dynasty who often favored the Rome's enemies, Parthia, being their predecessors. As a result, the Romans were desperate for a faithful subject who was more likely to keep Jewish militants at bay. Enter Herod, an aristocratic half-Jew, deeply paranoid of local Jewish rivals. For the Romans, he was a match made in heaven. Because of this, Roman influence would explode. He gave taxes that treated the population of Judea as a full Roman province, known as the poll taxes, which was a grave insult to the Jewish people. He funded lavish construction products, including temples for Gentiles and Roman colonies. Worst of all, he installed a golden Roman eagle above the Jewish temple, which was perceived as an attack on Jewish identity itself. His army was mostly non-Jewish, advisors and politicians given to Greeks, while the high priests themselves were stacked by foreign Jews. To many, Herod's rule wasn't just subjugation, it was cultural erasure. As Dr. Uda puts it, Judea had become a nation of slaves. And after Herod died in 4 BC, things would only get worse. His kingdom was divided, and by 6 AD, Judea was fully annexed as a Roman province. Rome would double down on taxation, sparking outrage. In addition to the destruction of the golden eagle at the temple several decades prior, a rebellion was led by Judas of Galilee, a radical who saw Roman rule as a heresy. Most importantly, his rebellion would spark the Zealot movement, a group convinced that freedom could only be achieved through revolution. Although Judas's revolt did fail, his ideas endured. Roman taxation wasn't purely destructive though. I really need to make this clear. It did fund jobs like the renovation of the Second Temple, and without these Roman policies, people would have fled in even larger droves from Judea. But when the temple was finished in 64 AD, tens of thousands were suddenly unemployed, while tax burdens remained high. Imagine yourself as a Jewish worker in 64 AD. The temple's done, you're out of work, Markets are flooded with Roman imports. Farming is risky, ruined by droughts that stretched across the 60s AD. Rich foreigners buy land you can't afford, and Rome still demands high taxes. Even the pro-Roman historian Tacitus reported that taxation was so rampant that even Roman governors begged for decreases in taxation. While sometimes the Romans may have relented, it never fully changed, as building programs remained ambitious and the Romans increasingly had to fund their wars. The hopelessness boiled over, and just 2 years after the Second Temple's completion in 66 AD, Roman rule in Judea collapsed. But why then? Why not earlier? Well, the answer is simple. By then, Rome had touched every corner of Jewish life. The Zealots, heirs of Judas of Galilee's rebellion, believed Roman domination was fundamentally against God's will, a belief becoming increasingly popular to the Jewish people. Meanwhile, many Jews fled instead of fighting. In cities like Alexandria, Rome, and Babylon, Jewish merchants and ex-soldiers built thriving diaspora communities. Some even gained political power, while Gentiles even increasingly converted to Judaism, something that is often overlooked. With visibility came backlash. In 66 AD, the same year as the revolt, over 50,000 Jews were massacred in a pogrom in Alexandria. Across the empire, tensions were absolutely boiling over. And inside Judea, people remembered what self-rule had looked like. Herod Agrippa I, who ruled from 40 to 44 AD, a Jewish king that briefly was free from Roman interference, was seen by some as even a messianic figure. After his death, though, Rome resumed direct control. Demand for autonomy surged as even the upper class of Jewish society became estranged by the increasingly foreign-influenced aristocracy of Judea, an issue that will grow important under leaders like Eleazar and Ananus. What resulted from this cultural, social, and economic conflict was a complete degradation of Roman authority. Banditry grew increasingly common, putting more pressure on the Judean economy, while more Jews increasingly fled Judea for better opportunities. The rich aristocrats increasingly centralized control across Judea, while zealot movements would increasingly gain popularity across the region. It seemed the only solution to perceived Roman oppression was a Jewish uprising, and the spark that lit the fire of the Jewish-Roman War would finally come in the year 66 AD. It was the spring of 66 AD in the city of Caesarea, a colony founded by Herod the Great. Was supposed to be just any other day for local Caesareans would soon turn into the spring of Jewish revolutionary action. It was the single city that would ignite the flame that engulfed an entire nation. At the time, Caesarea was a boiling pot of ethnic tension. Jews and Greeks lived side by side, but side by side, of course, didn't necessarily mean living at peace. Both ethnic groups contested over who owned the city, and these urban Jews themselves were even described as disposed to be tumultuous by Josephus. These Jews, flocking to cities like it for employment, were gradually growing in power and authority, enraging the Greeks, who thought it would be humiliating to let the lesser Jews overtake them. Ever since 64 AD, Judea was also run under the rule of Gessius Florus, a pro-Roman governor who was known for his favoritism towards Gentiles, which often left local Jews with the short end of the stick. The breaking point, as a result, would be local Greeks growing cocky and even sacrificing birds in front of the synagogue, a violation of Jewish purity laws. But of course, them doing this obviously enraged local Jews, who demanded Governor Florus and Roman soldiers to punish the Greeks. Roman soldiers stepped in on the side of the Greeks. As a result, a riot would ensue between Greeks, Romans, and the Jews. Governor Florus, hearing of the growing unrest, would step in, but only to escalate. And when the Jews went back down, he ordered a massacre. Blood stained the streets of Caesarea, and this blood would eventually spread south to Jerusalem. That same year, Florus would continue in his perceived oppressive acts and take 17 talents, which would today be worth almost $500,000. Scholars acknowledge that Florus's action was due to Roman revenue demands, but was still perceived as the ultimate attack on Jewish identity, and Governor Florus almost definitely knew how provocative his action was. Riots ensued across Jerusalem, just as they did in Caesarea, and Governor Florus would loot the temple treasury in retaliation, the very heart of Jewish worship. both sides would increasingly provoke one another as riots spread across the streets of Jerusalem, which Florus would respond with mass executions. The Roman mindset was clear: no compromise, only domination. This would lead to the deaths of 6,000 under Florus's massacre of Jerusalem. Now, up to this point, Jewish riots were always disorganized and with no well-connected leadership. This was essential to revolts like the Maccabean Revolt several centuries prior. However, anger boiled over in the Jewish upper class over the centralization of power in foreigners' hands. This is where the high captain of the Temple of Jerusalem, Eleazar ben Ananias, stepped in. Eleazar was the son of the elitist high priest, Ananias, but instead of bowing to his father's conservative pro-Roman tendencies, he took an incredibly bold move. Seeing the massacre of his kin at Caesarea in Jerusalem in the summer of 66 AD, Eleazar would refuse the daily sacrifices to the Roman emperor, a tradition that had gone on for decades. To the Romans, this was a declaration of rebellion and warranted escalation. Florus begged Syrian governor Cestius Gallus for assistance in suppressing the rebellion, and who sent a garrison to quell the rebellion. But it was a trap. Using the winding streets of Jerusalem, Eleazar's revolutionary forces were able to ambush and kill many Romans. They surrendered, and Eleazar promised them permission to leave. But instead, as they were about to leave, Jewish swords turned on the Romans as an entire garrison was butchered. Amidst this chaos, the Jewish elites looked on in horror as the celebrity of the zealot Eleazar grew. Never since the days of Judas the Galilean all those decades ago could a zealot gain such power and prestige, and so quickly. And among those angry was Eleazar's own father, Ananias. He was enraged by the actions of his son, and knowing of this familial discontent, Syrian governor Gallus attempted to take advantage. By this point, Florus was out of power, having been utterly humiliated by Eleazar and his allies, and Gallus saw an opportunity to create a Jewish-Roman alliance to suppress the revolts and gain his own power, potentially in Judea. Gallus sent messengers who would demand Ananias to hand over his son, Eleazar, to Roman authorities. But interestingly, Ananias refused. Instead, moderate Jewish elites devised a plan for the king of Judea to send a Jewish cavalry division to negotiate an end to the conflict. But this peaceful action would completely backfire, as the cavalry fled or deserted to Eleazar, further strengthening the revolt. Gallus, having heard of these escalations, surmised that peaceful suppression nor intimidation could suppress the revolt anymore. Gallus in the north realized the only way to defeat them was the Gallic treatment, mass carnage and intimidation. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers would march south in September of 66 AD to Judea. In the meantime, Eleazar had to centralize his control over Judea. Eleazar would begin his purge of Jewish society, expelling those disloyal and slaughtering those he perceived as a threat. Among those he distrusted was his own father and brother. Ananias and Ezekias, his brother, were forced into hiding, crawling into a canal to escape Jerusalem. Ananias himself, only months prior, had refused to hand over his own son. Ananias and Ezekias were captured by a section of Eleazar's military and butchered. Shortly after, Ananias' house was burned to the ground by the revolutionaries. Nobody knows for certain if Eleazar was involved directly, but his guilt is apparent. Eleazar had to wipe the slate clean, and to do so, he had to cleanse his own family. No longer was Jerusalem ruled by priests and governors, but by a fire and vengeance. But eventually, cracks in Eleazar's leadership began to show. He appointed many fiery commanders, as his military capabilities were still lacking. In this military vacuum, zealots would rise through the ranks, with two important men being Simon Bar Giora and Eleazar ben Simon, or to simplify, Ben Simon and Bar Giora. Ben Simon was a firebrand and lion of the battlefield, having likely originated from the zealous centers of Galilee to the north. His military might would become apparent later, while Bar Giora was known for his fiery will and determination that captivated the hearts and minds of the people. And as Gallus's army approached Jerusalem, killing tens of thousands in retaliatory massacres. The need for a defense of Jerusalem was apparent. These two leaders would lead Jerusalem's defense against the Roman legate Cestius Gallus, while a new politician named Ananus would rise the ranks in Jerusalem. Gallus's army marched towards Jerusalem until 6 miles away from the city. The Jewish army attacked, and against the odds, several thousand Jewish fighters repelled the might of the Roman army, with the two commanders mentioned, Bar Gior and Ben Simon, rising as national heroes. They captured Roman supplies and shattered the enemy's morale. Gallus himself was wounded and later died. It should have been Eleazar's crowning moment. But Eleazar was no longer the center of attention, as more zealous leaders gained popular support. And from the shadows of the purged aristocracy, one man emerged, the aforementioned Ananus. A Sadducee, a former priest, and now the cunning mind who would outmaneuver them all. In the aftermath of victory, Ananus moved fast. He ousted Simon ben Giora, then Ben Simon. Rival after rival vanished through politics or murder. Suddenly, as Eleazar's support dwindled, Ananus managed to gain connections and kick those who threatened his power. He became supreme leader of the revolt, sidelining the unstable Eleazar. The revolution had seemingly turned full circle, back into the hands of elites that it was starting to destroy. But was this stability or a new kind of tyranny? Ananus's words were honey. His influence became unmatched, as Bar Gior and Ben Simon were forced onto the sidelines in their moment of glory after the Battle of Jerusalem. Even Josephus, the famous historian, was appointed general by this regime. Jerusalem grew stronger than ever, as Roman attacks slowed, and Ananus rose against all odds as the moderate elite controlling the city. The people had no choice but to rally around a man from the hierarchy they resented. Ananus had done the impossible. He tamed the revolt and united the city and restored power to the Jewish priests. But power comes with a price, and enemies, even ones he once tried to purge, have a way of returning. And at the height of Ananus's power, the city would split again. Join us in the next video this week as we explore the last phase of the Jewish revolt and its climax. Will Ananus's power last? Will Eleazar the Zealot make a comeback? Were the Romans justified in all of this? Comment your thoughts down below, and I'll see you next time.